Welcome and thank you for joining today's Ignite Talks on the future of capitalism and trust in democratic institutions. The Ignite Talk format is a 5-minute long presentation. Think of it as a fast-paced lightning talk or abbreviated TED Talk. For these Ignite Talks, we will have a sequence of five-minute presentations from a dynamic group of experts: Silji Mpampa, Andrea Bomnim-Blanc, Peter Golias, Malik Kadir, and Julia Palmeres. After all the Ignite Talks have concluded, presenters will be designated into one of two breakout rooms, depending on their presentation topic. We invite you to join a room of your choice to engage with the presenters on their viewpoints presented, share your own insights, and hear perspectives of other conference participants on the topics. Without further ado, we are pleased to begin the presentations. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be presenting very quickly on the future of capitalism. In other words, where we believe capitalism needs to go. So we know that around the world, we've got at least 4 billion people who earn less than $10 a day. What do we do with this sheer mass of people in poverty when there are enough resources to go around? I argue that we need to encourage capitalism to be strategically deployed into inclusive business, into inclusive economies in order to produce inclusive prosperity. What is inclusive business? It is the business where you employ the poor either as suppliers, producers, business partners, employees, or consumers or users of a product which improves their quality of life and improves their revenues and income. And inclusive economies, according to the Rockefeller Foundation, has at least 5 hallmarks. Number 1, they are sustainable. Number 2, they are participatory. You can get masses of people gainfully employed and doing something for themselves in an inclusive economy. They are stable. They don't exist only today. They're there tomorrow, and they're available for the next 10 years. They are growing economies, and they're equitable. And what we're looking to get out of combining inclusive business models with inclusive economies is inclusive prosperity, which is the sort of prosperity that includes the entire population of a country, and that gets an entire population of a country empowered to contribute towards their own futures, and also for the entire population to be able to share out of the benefits of capitalism. To me, that is the future. The question is, how do you get there? 7 simple things to consider. Number 1, there are big constraints as to why it is not currently happening that way today. And those constraints, in order to remove them, require a huge level of innovation. Very often, a lot of innovation in technology in order to coordinate large numbers of people and fintechs to deliver the kinds of finance that is required and so on. For instance, a friend of mine has a business where he has 44 million customers, but there are only 5 of them. The rest is servers and all sorts of computers, and they are in nano lending very minute amounts of money every day. So we want to make sure that that kind of innovation leads to increased incomes, and that there is inclusion in that both women, poor women, and the youth participate, not just the men and those who are already wealthy. And that whatever innovation happens in the value chain can be integrated into existing value chains in order to open it up and mainstream it into the way things are done, which then attracts investment. And once investment starts, private investment goes into it, we find that it captures the imagination of the policymakers, and they respond as well by improving infrastructure. And from infrastructure and all of this investment, if you sustain it and keep it stable over time, you institutionalize a new way of doing business. So, a quick example is that whatever you're doing has to be meaningful in an inclusive business model. Nestle in Nigeria has this youth agripreneurship program where we're trying to find 18 to 35-year-olds and get them more interested in agriculture, because maize, a principal product that they use in their own formulations, are now over 53 years old. And yet the median age in Nigeria is 18. So they feel in another decade or so, their supply chains will be threatened. So they're providing bundled services of certified seed, the right inputs, finance, everything that is required, including know-how, in a bundle to the poor. And we're finding that the poor are increasing and doubling their productivity year on year. And they're also able to get plugged into structured markets. So they started in the first year with 400 farmers who went from like 2.5 tons per hectare all the way to 5-6 tons. Now they are at 5,000 the second year, and trying to get all 5,000 to produce at 6 tons per hectare and over. And in the third year, they're moving to 50,000, and they're going to keep increasing in geometrical progression, and then increasing the hectarage that each farmer is managing in order to make them even more wealthy. All at the same time, Nestle is getting a more secure supply chain and more secure into the future. So I think that if we were to do well with capitalism, it is going to work at scale. It's going to bring a lot of innovation. It's going to use technology. It's going to work with so many of the poor to reduce that 4 billion that live on less than $10 a day. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. And I am in New York City, so I say good morning to those of us in the Western Hemisphere. I'm here to talk about the future of capitalism through the lens of stakeholder capitalism rising, which is a very interesting lens that I think is determined by a lot of what's going on in the world today. But before I give you my snapshot of stakeholder capitalism, I just want to talk about the three kinds of big type of capitalism that we see in the world today. We have state capitalism, which is basically government determined, where the government steers the economy and intervenes whenever necessary. And business interests are subsidiary to those government interests. Then there's shareholder capitalism, which is the most commonplace that we have now, where the owners and the business leaders, the shareholders are basically the kings and the queens. They are the ones that rule. Not much else is considered in terms of goals and objectives. And it's really about short-term profit maximization. And it's based on what Milton Friedman talked about years ago. And finally, there's stakeholder capitalism, which is rising. And what it is different from the others is that it's taking into account the importance, the expectations, the impact, the rights and responsibilities towards employees, customers, and other stakeholders like perhaps supply chain, other companies that are working with you. So let's talk about why stakeholder capitalism is actually really rising now. And I have a piece that I wrote recently that talks about the mega trends of our times. And I have 5 that are sort of multi-year things that are happening that I think are pushing us more and more in the direction of a different form of capitalism. Tech disruption at the speed of light, self-explanatory. The fact that leadership and institutional trust has declined for over a decade or two is really important in this equation. complex interconnected risk intensifying. Clearly, this is something that we've seen in just a conglomeration and convergence in this last year and a half of the global pandemic. Environmental, social, governance, technology, economic issues are all coming together. Global geopolitical tectonics are shifting, which determines how different countries are working with each other or not. And then finally, the stakeholder capitalism rising. And why I think this is so important is that we have also the convergence of existential issues, issues of poverty, of hunger, of quality education, of gender equality, of clean water, clean energy, economic development, all these issues that are very nicely condensed in the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And then there are other really important existential issues like cybersecurity, for example, technology ethics, artificial intelligence ethics, and so on. And these potential stakeholders that you see on this slide could be just about anyone, and they have expectations, they have needs, they have requirements. They can also influence whether a business will be successful or unsuccessful. So it's kind of all converging. The existential issues of our time, the climate change issues, inequality issues are coming together with the rise of the stakeholder, including especially the younger generations around the world. And here's a small example, or maybe a big one if you want to look at it that way, of how the climate change issue has suddenly burst into the boardrooms of the most powerful companies in the world. Exxon just lost 3 board members to a tiny hedge fund that got together a bunch of other very powerful interests to put together a plan to depose 3 of their existing board members. And it's all around climate. Here's just a picture of the tsunami of ESG activity that is taking place. Investment by investors and others. It has grown exponentially in the last few years. And then last but not least is this whole idea of the central role of trust. Trust is defined by the Edelman Trust Barometer as a combination of ethicality and competency. And we see that business actually is doing better than any of the other 4 institutions that they're looking at. And that means that business has an opportunity to set the trend and become the trustworthy institution, but it requires humility, it requires influence. And here are some examples of companies that have been rated high for their stakeholder positions on 19 different 19 different issues, and then they incorporate those issues, stakeholder issues, into their organizational strategy. And then finally, I have a typology of leadership when it comes to environmental, social, governance, and technology issues. And I think we need to work more and more as stakeholder capitalists on putting together leaders in businesses that are the responsible and the enlightened. Thank you so much for your attention.
Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Peter Goliasz, and I am leading INEQO think tank, which is an economic think tank based in Slovakia in Central Europe. And here are my thoughts on how to restore trust in democratic institutions. Okay, so first of all, let me summarize conclusions of 2 important books that describes links between quality of democracy and quality of life. The first is called Why Nations Fail: The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty. It basically says that better institutions and better democracy leads to better life. It is because the institutions that protect people from power abuse are opening door to innovation and economic growth. The second book is called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth and says quite the opposite, that the economic growth improves morality of people and opens door to more inclusive reforms. In fact, it says that better life leads to better democracy. Both books present many examples from history supporting their conclusions, and in my view, they are complementary. Basically, they show that causality works in both ways. In the long term, better institutions and democracy stimulate economic growth, and the economic growth leads to better democracy. Both factors are enforcing each other, and the result is the virtuous circle, where most democratic countries end up with the highest standards of living. Or exactly the opposite, the vicious circle, where the least democratic countries end up among the poorest. Now let us look at the evidence. In this chart, you can see that more democratic countries, which are to the right side, are in general wealthier as they have higher per capita GDP. And really, the wealthiest are the most democratic countries marked with green color. The poorest are the autocratic or hybrid regimes marked with red or yellow color. As you can see, there are also some wealthy countries among red authoritarian states, but these are all oil-rich countries. This chart shows the same story, but here I added longevity on the vertical axis. As you can see, the most democratic countries concentrate in the upper right corner and have green color. This means that they belong to the richest in the world and people there live the longest lives. The bottom left part of the chart shows mostly red and yellow dots, which represent poor countries with mostly autocratic regimes. A few green dots on the left side are again oil-rich, autocratic countries. Finally, this chart shows the link between quality of democracy and happiness of people living in the country. Again, the general pattern is that the more democratic country, the happier people live there. You can find some exceptions, which are usually oil-rich or sun-rich countries. It is clear that the money or the sun can bring you some happiness, but not as much as the democracy. The message is clear. The happiest people in the world live in full democracies. So now we have the answers. If we want to restore trust in democracy, in democratic institutions, we have to take care of economic growth by implementing necessary reforms and by rapid vaccination against COVID, which is a hot topic today. Further, we have to educate people so that they understand the links between quality of democracy and quality of life, and we have to improve quality of democratic institutions. This is, of course, not an easy task. According to the Democracy Index produced by the Economist Intelligence Unit, there are just 23 full democracies globally, and only 8.4% of the world population live in full democracies. This shows how difficult it is to build a full democracy and get in the virtuous circle. As you can see, most people live in flawed democracies, and more than 1/3 of global population live in authoritarian regimes. In Slovakia, we are regularly asking people in representative public opinion polls how they would like to change current democratic system. And we are always getting the same top two answers. Firstly, they call for higher engagement of honest people in public affairs. And secondly, they call for more independent and professional public institutions that protect people from power abuse. So the key question is how to get honest and professional people to important public offices, judicial and regulatory institutions, or state-owned enterprises. Our answer is that we need real competition and transparent selection procedures for top positions. This means open call for candidates, clear selection criteria, independent experts in selection committees, public hearings of top candidates, or publishing their CVs and visions. In short, to complete my answers, we should improve quality of democratic institutions by putting the best people in the top positions in a transparent and competitive process. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for taking part. It's a pleasure to be amongst you all. My name is Maali Khadr, and I can see from all those before me, I have big shoes to fill. Will do my best to keep you entertained. To talk about the future of capitalism implies that something is wrong or something needs to change. To decide on what needs to change, we need to understand what is the problem. As an ESG specialist, and I've been called a tree hugger amongst many other things, but let's not go there. That can be a rather long list, but with a limit of 5 minutes, I need to focus on a few key notions. To get into those, let me start with some basics. I'm not a political scientist or expert on the topic of capitalism, unlike my peers before me. I have no technical, political, or economic expertise to address this topic studiously, but I can only speak from my humble personal opinion. Capitalism really, as I understand it, can have two perspectives, a political one and an economical one. I'll be addressing it from an economic aspect. So what's wrong with capitalism? If we look at some statistics, the World Bank, almost 15% of the world's population is living on less than 1.25 per day. Oddly enough, this is a progressive statistic where 20 years ago that was at 36%. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. 8 men control as much wealth as the poorer half of the world combined. The state of the world is in such an abysmal state, so much that the UN had to create global goals to eradicate poverty, hunger, provide access to health and education. I believe my colleague talked about the Sustainability Development Goals. These are some statistics before COVID. Let's not get into how much worse things are after COVID. And there's much more data available online. But all that being said and done, capitalism has not made the world a better place. Why? In my humble opinion, the key issues about capitalism, or where capitalism has failed us, is capitalism results in inequality. Capitalism is short-sighted and it does not account for value creation in non-monetary terms. What does that mean? First, capitalism results in inequality. At the core of capitalism is that of free market. If you work hard and persevere, you will be rewarded financially. True or false? Not so black and white, but I think there's some truth to it, but there's a lot of false in it too. Unfortunately, capitalism, by virtue of the free market notion, eventually and inevitably does yield power to those that succeed, and therefore have capital. And in turn, this shifts the balance from a free market to an unfair and biased market, creating unfavorable market conditions, encouraging the rich to get wealthier and the poor to get poorer. First generation wealth may be earned, but what about wealth passed down from generation to generation? What did the second or third generation do to earn the advantage or the head start into the world? This begs the questions, are we really talking about equality or equity? What is it that we want? I think the picture sums it up really well. Should everyone have the same stepping stone, irrespective of where they're coming from, or should everyone be provided with what they need to succeed? And who decides that? Don't have the answer, unfortunately. Capitalism is short-sighted. Capitalism's primary objective is to make more money. Look at tools like advertising. What is advertising if not propaganda campaigns? The whole purpose of advertising is to manufacture a desire. Brands around the world spend over $500 billion a year in advertising. Advertising is not about making genuine decisions or about identifying or addressing pre-existing needs. It's driven by a desire to generate profit for companies that will tell you what you want and then sell it to you. Essentially, it relies on you buying more stuff that you don't need. Capitalism is measured simply in terms of cash. It does not take into account human capital, social capital. Putting all these together, generating capital often comes at a long-term cost that is not considered accounted for, such as natural resources, human resources, etc. Money used to be a tool. Now it's the center, the very purpose of our collective life as we continuously adopt capitalism and as it expands in all other jurisdictions. Number one rule, make more capital, because capital brings you everything else. It buys you food, gets you housing, healthcare, college education, but does it really? Does it buy the non-tangibles that we seek, well-being, health, family cohesion, etc.? So how do you measure value creation in non-monetary terms? Capitalism doesn't really give you an equation for that. Efficiency of economies are measured by their GDP, but that really does not take into account anything else. So how do you measure value in non-monetary terms? If you are happy, that's worth $59.99, or if you have family, that is worth $7,550. I mean, who puts these values? There needs to be a way to add value to non-tangible items relative to emotional value. This does give rise to many questions like how to address the relativity factor. What makes me happy might not apply to someone else. Family might be important to me, but not as much to the next person. Capitalism does not provide me with a mechanism to capture such value or take such value into account. So what should the future of capitalism be? Taking into account that capitalism is not in and of itself a living being that needs to be handled, it is not the culprit. It is those capitalists who focus on short-term gain with little or no care for the future. Capitalism is only as good as those who practice it. Capitalism formalized in the 18th century and spread around the world because of globalization. Thank you for that. It remains our default operating system. It is based primarily on self-interest, but we know that self-interest is only one component of our humanity. Most of us have a selfless gene, and it has become increasingly evident that reliance on self-interest is no longer sufficient, especially when the resulting outcomes are exclusive and damaging, as we see around the world today. If capitalism is to remain as the primary operating system of our world, it makes sense to write values and ethics into its source code to create a more ethical capitalism. Is ethical capitalism a thing? Ethical capitalism is not some implausible manifesto, but the proven mechanism for driving long-term value creation. Studies by Harvard Business School, Babson College, and others have demonstrated that firms that prioritize stakeholder engagement, to Andera's point, and take a long-term view significantly outperform competitors in the stock market over time. The potential dividend for doing good in our world are enormous, from tackling climate change to gender equality. Ethical capitalism must be more than a conversation about values. It must lead to changed behaviors embedded into the day-to-day business. These new businesses are not opting out of capitalist systems. They are very much within it, yet viewing money not as evil, but as a tool to create a better world. Just a few last thoughts. We're often quoted, money is the root of all evil, but people forget the whole quote. The love of money is the root of all evil, and only remember the latter. Capitalism tends to go wrong when the people running businesses love money and profit at the expense of all other factors. People often quote Adam Smith, whose ideas for a free market opened the world to capitalism. However, Adam Smith also said, no society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the greater part of the members is poor and miserable. So it seemed that at its initiation, capitalism had a heart after all, and it is this compassion and justice that many new businesses are rediscovering. Should humanity serve the economy or the other way around? There are global resources out there, so why are there still homeless people, or why are people still dying from starvation? Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Julia Pomares from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Very happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Let me tell you that, confess that one night of insomnia during this very long quarantine, I woke up dreaming that a time machine appeared on the balcony of my apartment. I didn't remember where I was going to, or if it's transporting me to the future or to the past, but I found myself imagining where I wish I would travel. And I imagined going to the future, not too far, 2030, a very important year in our imagination of the future. And there are two questions that I would have liked to ask the machine. The first one, that probably is the question that everybody would want to ask the machine, is the COVID the first in a series of intermittent pandemics that we are going to become used to? I don't have answers to that question, probably the most important one. I'm a political scientist. But the second question is the one that I want to focus today, is that which of the many traits that seem unique these days about the pandemic are going to survive afterwards, and we will remember in 2030. And there is one aspect of COVID-19 that I venture is important, that it will become also important when we look at this moment from the future. And it's the fact that this pandemic coincided with a historic moment of transformation of global capitalism. And my colleagues were talking about this before. And 2020 probably will remain in the history books, not only because of the COVID year, but also the end of the transition to the intangible economy and the world of artificial intelligence. And living in the cloud, or more precisely, the digitalization of the economy, is a process that has been going on for a few decades, but it has been much accelerated by the arrival of COVID-19. And while many consequences of this new moment of our economy were already evident before the pandemic, for example, the automation of work and e-commerce, I think that the virus found us in the dark about how institutions will be transformed after the pandemic, both domestically and globally. And I think that the exponentiality of digital transformation lead us to imagine, at the beginning, at least, of the pandemic, exponential change in our institutions. And I don't see that clear now, a year afterwards. I think that we were enthusiastic about the mantra of crisis as opportunity, and sometimes I feel that we might go for the more modest mantra of not every crisis is a turning point. But I would like to be optimistic and think that we take this turning point, this crisis, as a turning point for shaping our institutions. And I don't have a time machine, and as long as I don't have one, I can go and hypothesize how it would look like in 2030 and think about whether this COVID-19 pandemic will accelerate, will stop, or will change the course of trends in democratic governance that we were already observing before the first case of COVID-19. And we know that over recent years, there has been a strong deterioration of the liberal component of democracies and a resurgence of nationalisms in several parts of the world. That mix of distrust in politics, low voter turnout, and polarization had been an attended time bomb before. And we are now seeing that, although at the beginning there were signs that the pandemic will reinforce populist and national leaders, we are seeing now in several countries that electorates can punish incumbent populist leaders who fail to respond effectively to the pandemic. So I think that it's a sign of optimism. But we do see a clear sign in most countries that the continuity in the decrease of trust in institutions. So against this background, my point today to initiate the discussion with all of you afterwards is to get beyond the look at and the focus on changes in electoral institutions or electoral rules and think about the need to ask leaders, not only political leaders in all type of institutions, to tell new narratives of politics. And narratives and the storytelling is very important because it has two relevant functions: to build identity and to mobilize action. They point us to the future, they provide us with a horizon, and we need now new narratives to mobilize us collectively, and that is very important, even so in this moment or in these times of fragmentation. Narratives that have the challenge of holding us together beyond our differences. And from my view, we need to frame the debate about all these trends that we are seeing during this pandemic, or about how we focus them on increasing trust. For example, we should think of digitalization, not only focusing on the potential to improve provision of services, but to reconnect to citizens. We need to promote new ways of dialoguing with the citizenry and engaging in better and more genuine conversations. And just as in chess, after lamenting because and being quite sorry that Deep Blue machine beat Kasparov, we managed to be Centaur chess, half human, half artificial. I think that the great challenge we have today is to build a hybrid democracy. That means an augmented democracy instead of less democracy. So I hope in my next trip at the DeLorean, I hope to check out some of these hypotheses. And I'm lucky because 2021 is the year that DeLorean is going to be relaunched. So happy to ask the time machine about these trends. Thank you very much.